We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
In the wake of the Texas school shooting, the usual calls for gun control are up and running. But would they actually do anything other than disarm law-abiding citizens? Well, that's the question that we're going to delve deep into now with the help of Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and host of the most excellent Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza. Let's add an esquire to that. Welcome back, Scott.
Cheers, Mark. Thank you so much.
So, Scott, obviously this was a tragic event made more so, I think, by the age of the children who were murdered. But it seems that for politicians that as soon as the tears dry, the first instinct is to demand some kind of gun control. Why the knee-jerk reaction?
Well, because they're impotent in the face of this violence, and that is the enemy of their political power. And so the call to action is to be seen to be doing something. You know, we have this reaction on the that crops up every time with the sort of gun grabber crowd where they say, like, you know, to hell with your thoughts and prayers. But really, in the immediate aftermath, especially, that is basically all that's appropriate. President Biden went out and spoke about the Texas massacre, and we don't even have the facts yet in terms of like what guns the person used to murder the children, for instance, and the adults who were also murdered. But we don't know whether it was a handgun yet, or a rifle, or a quote unquote assault rifle, as they would like, to be banned as a result of it. That's the reason why for the calls, I think.
Let's jump into that, what you said about assault weapons, assault rifles. Yeah. Now, Scott, I believe the first call to action after this event was an assault weapons ban. I do want to get into the weeds on this because it seems that both who is defining what an assault weapon is? Because I figure if you ask 100 people, you'd get at least 4 or 5 different answers. And B, if it's the same as what was brought in before, didn't that prove to not actually work, despite what President Biden said after the events?
Well, let's take question A. For people who are not in the gun world and in the gun culture, it can be a little bit challenging to learn different vocabulary for gun parts and things. But I would encourage them to think of it, if you use a car analogy, Mark, we could say, like, let's say there was a problem with speeding, killing people, and they wanted to ban sports cars, and they just instituted a sports car ban. Well, you can imagine what would constitute a sports car. For some people,
2 seats and a blonde.
Rear wheel drive and a manual transmission. That's what I would vote, with high horsepower and lightweight. But at what weight would the car be overweight for a sports car, for instance? Or if it was all-wheel drive, could you have the same car then? And if they made the ban in rear-wheel drive, could they then add all-wheel drive and then avoid the ban for sports cars? Or maybe there would be not just the regular engine part, but a turbocharger might be the thing. And these are how these things are applied to the gun world, which is that there is no commonly accepted term about an assault weapon or an assault rifle. This was a terminology that was devised by gun control proponents. They wished to have a cause to ban certain guns. They basically thought that if we trace the lineage, Mark, it actually goes from a group called Handgun Control Incorporated, which was the dominant anti-gun group, and later James Brady, who was Ronald Reagan's was he his Treasury Secretary? Anyway, who was shot in an assassination attempt against Ronald Reagan. And, he basically became, horribly damaged for the rest of his life because of the injuries he sustained while being shot. And he joined Handgun Control Incorporated, became, a big guy in that. And his wife, Sarah Brady, became, the head of it, I think, at least in titular fashion, if not in the actual directing of the policy. But that's a long way around to say that morphed from the handgun control to their perception that the quote unquote assault weapons or rifles would be a better sell politically. They could get more traction under that. It was always a bit bizarre, though, Mark, because the number of people that are murdered by rifles writ large is exceedingly small for firearms death. And then for assault weapons or guns that will grant the gun grabber's definition of what an assault weapon would even be smaller than that. And just to circle back around to the sports car analogy, if we turn that now to the guns, for instance, there are many cosmetic features that are included in the assault weapons ban. Basically, it's like there's a term used on the sort of forums of gun proponents called EBRs, or evil black rifles, and that's how the
anything you might find on a Call of Duty video game.
Exactly. If it looks like it's cool and fun, then they want to ban it, and that, of course, is one of the reasons why gun collectors like some of those guns. It just like with anything that is collected, people like things that this bright shiny object, relatively speaking, and even if those things don't affect functionality of the firearm or their particular, if you want to use the term, deadliness, that really doesn't come into play for much of what constitutes this assault weapon stuff. So that was point A. Now, point B
I'll give you a little reminder of point B to the audience.
Yeah.
And that was that if this particular, as we call it, an assault weapons ban was brought in, and it's the same as the one that was brought in before.
1994,
exactly. And that didn't actually work, did it? Even though Joe Biden, in his, what I thought was actually quite a good speech after the tragic events of Texas, I thought he did quite a good job until he veered off and started.
Yes.
Yeah. And
no, it didn't reduce.
He touted that as being a success. I seem to remember it differently.
Yeah, the studies that have been done do not indicate. And by the way, it's hard to. The numbers are so small for how many people were actually murdered by these weapons. You could almost make an argument that it's statistically too small to be able to measure with that legislation. And here's the thing about the assault weapons ban, and one of the reasons why it didn't make a dime's bit of difference, is that all it did was increase the price of those things that it banned, because it didn't ban the possession of them. We've got hundreds of millions of firearms in the United States, and at least many, many dozens of millions of those are quote unquote assault weapons, as they would be defined by the gun control groups. So what these bans do is they don't make the possession of these devices illegal. What they do is they ban new production and sale, generally speaking. And so all it does is it increases the cost to acquire that item but there's plenty in the marketplace, right? It's just, I'm thinking now of the high capacity or full capacity magazine ban, for instance. And what all that does is it increases the cost to acquire one of those magazines that's currently legal in existence. It doesn't prevent you from acquiring one or owning one. And so unless they wanted to do a real ban, which it is.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment, because the idea that they could actually implement a ban on owning these weapons, that to me seems like you're almost declaring war on the American people, because I can't see people handing those over willingly. And how are they going to get them other than going in there with guns?
You've got two issues. One is the practical issue. Just think of collecting any number of objects in coffee mugs, computer keyboards. I'm just looking at what I've got in front of me here. Okay.
Scott D. Cosenza, inspired by everything in the room at the time.
And if you think of collecting, 350 million computer key, like just the logistics of it is not small. And then while I don't know that most gun owners, or even, some significant minority of gun owners would, I think, take it, as you say, as a declaration of war, and would resist that with violence and their firearms. And even if that was only, 0.01% of gun owners in America who wanted to do that presents a serious and potential existential problem for the people. Not to mention the fact that you would hope there would be some significant portion of police officers and law enforcement who would decline and refuse to disarm Americans. Now, maybe that's a wishful thinking on my part.
But of course, Eric Swalwell would suggest it doesn't really matter because he has the nuclear weapons. Well, him and his Chinese girlfriend Spy, of course. So
let me just add this one point, if I might, Mark. This is something I've thought about quite a bit. The other thing that we have, which is reflexive with the politicians' statements after these massacres, is they almost always propose legislation that had already they've already wished for and maybe even proposed before, and almost certainly it would not have changed the outcome of the events that they're responding to. And that's sort of a problem, I think, that we don't see generally in areas that aren't hot button or emotional issues. We have an issue with a water plant in Flint, or the pipes there not getting clean water to the people. We don't suggest some program that's sort of been a wish list of a politician for a while, but that wouldn't actually result in the clean water. And unless we know, how this person got their guns, and what law might make a difference for that, even if it would be constitutional or would not, that's sort of would make sense to go with, right? In other words, so in the wake of Adam Lanza's, we know a lot more about. I'll just refer to the Sandy Hook massacre and Adam Lanza, because we know a lot more about that shooting and that person than we do about both Buffalo and the Texas massacres, because they're still new. But we know that Adam Lanza stole the firearm that he used to murder those students from his mother before he murdered her. And that there would have been no way to restrict her from getting the gun if you were going to allow civilian purchase of the gun at all, meaning she jumped through all the hoops required to get that gun. So if you said, well, we need to erect more hoops and hurdles for gun ownership, you have to at some point say, well, yeah, even though we erected these hurdles, or we would erect these hurdles, she still would have gotten the gun. And Mr. Lanza would still then have been able to procure it in the manner that he did. So what we see is all the time after these events is the proposal of legislation that would not have affected the tragedy in the first place, or the crime in the first place. And so that's why, for those of us, I think, who know and study the gun issue, especially from a pro-gun side, we see it as just naked ambition to take away the gun rights of the people. If you're saying, hey, we have this horrible event, and as a result, we need to get through this legislation, but the legislation wouldn't have prevented the horrible event in the first place, well, then it seems more like political games playing rather than some genuine attempt to reduce the likelihood of such an event in the future.
All right, Scott, thank you ever so much for the information. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's almost it for this edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our guests, Lisa K. Donner, Dave Patterson, Jeff Charles, and as always, Scott D. Cosenza for joining us. And of course, thanks to you at home for taking the time to tune in. My final thought for this week: when the lies and misrepresentations become so abundant that it stretches credulity, we have to ask ourselves whether we're just more attuned to deception, whether the lies have increased, or if, unfortunately, the powers that be know that we know that they're lying and they just don't care enough to cover themselves. Of all these options, it seems perhaps the most dangerous for liberty is the last option, that they just don't care if we know they're being deceitful, because that would mean that the power of people is no longer absolute, or as Thomas Jefferson put it so well, when government fears the people, there's liberty. When the people fear the government, there's tyranny. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fight for freedom.
The tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on.